The session will come to order. Although you want to tell that joke, session will come to order. We are pleased and honored to have with us today former Attorney General of the United States, Ramsey, who will make such presentation as he may choose. General.
Thank you very much. It's a good feeling to be here with you again this year. I wish I could say it's been a good year for freedom and justice under law, but I can't say that. But at least in this company, you know that the struggle goes on and that we shall overcome. I will probably, unless my mind wanders, which it does, talk about three cases primarily. And I'll start and end with the case of Lyndon LaRouche and his co-defendants. Not because it's the alpha and omega, although it's about as close as a case gets to the potential perfidy of justice, but because it shows how bad it can be, and yet it has, as so very, very few of these cases ever do, a positive side that we have to consider. I came into the case after the trial. As a person who lives in the country and pays attention to these things, I followed it carefully. I knew something about the ways of the judicial district in which the case was filed and the meaning of filing a case there. To call it the rocket docket is a disservice unless you identify the rocket, because if there's a rocket in present use that would be similar, it would be the so-called depleted uranium-tipped missile, the silver bullet used in Iraq. In other words, it's a lethal rocket, not a rocket that sought truth or intended justice. I had watched this court crush a beautiful young Vietnamese man, David Trong, whose father had been vice president of his native land in the 50s. Because this tormented young man, seeing his country being destroyed, as a student, dared to participate in campus demonstrations against the war in Vietnam. And they actually put him in this court, claiming that he had engaged in espionage, pretty serious business. Now, you tell me how a young student from Vietnam, who's Vietnamese, can engage in espionage in the United States with members of the U.S. government necessarily, and you'll explain a near miracle to me. What he had tried to do is gather as much information as he possibly could about his own country to send to his own country so They would know as much as they possibly could, but not the government. He was from the South. He wasn't from the North, and it was during the conflict. I was prepared, therefore, for what might happen. I'd followed the earlier case in Boston, which by any measure was an extremely peculiar case, both in its charges, in its prosecution, and in its history. I knew the judge there as a fellow Texan. His brother, Page Keaton, had been dean of the law school where I started out down at the University of Texas. And he's one of the old school that doesn't like tricks, falsity, or injustice. And he became outraged with the prosecution. And did a lot. I can't tell you he did all that a judge could have done. I believe Odin will agree, though, he did a lot. There are not many judges who come through a political conditioning and process who have the courage to stand up to the power of the executive branch, to the FBI and others, and say the things that he did. And that's was almost an early end to a malicious prosecution. But in what was as complex and pervasive a utilization of law enforcement, prosecution, media, and non-governmental organizations focused on destroying an enemy. This case must be number one. There are some where the government itself may have done more and more wrongfully over a period of time. But the very networking and combination of federal, state, and local agencies, of executive and even some legislative and judicial branches, of major media and minor local media, and of influential lobbyist types, the ADL preeminently. This case takes the prize. The purpose can only be seen as destroying. It's more than a political movement. It's more than a political figure. It is those two. But it's a fertile engine of ideas. A common purpose of thinking and studying and analyzing to solve problems regardless of the impact on the status quo or on vested interests. It was a deliberate purpose to destroy that at any cost. Being personally immersed in two other cases right now, which I'm going to mention briefly. One, Waco. We were talking coming in from the airport. Just the deadly firepower of the government on a church. That was a church. I mean, you won't find lawyers in this country that spend as much time reading law books as those folks in that church spent every day reading the Bible. They read the Bible. They knew the Bible. You hear a lot of bad things about them, but I'll tell you, if you want to get someone who can quote the Bible and quote the Bible and quote the Bible, they could do it. Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, whose trial concluded yesterday and whose jury charge was set today, 196 pages, and oral arguments will begin Monday. Blind, had memorized the Holy Quran at age 11, became what in the Muslim world you call an hafiz. And I don't mean just memorize it like a child does so they can recite it back and maybe make a few mistakes here and there and have no meaning. I mean, he was 11 years old and he could withstand tough interrogation by octogenarian imams who had done nothing in their lives really but study, 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 study. And these people in Waco were like that with the Bible. Even the FBI concedes it. Be careful, because all of a sudden they'll recite whole books. You won't be able to get away. And yet all this law enforcement is coming down on them. We didn't have that violence, you might say, that physical violence in the LaRouche case. But the potential from one side was entirely there. The day they went out to seize 2 million documents, as I recall, I may be off on the number, I think it's 2 million. Big warehouse, this is a lot of documents. These people produce a lot of paper, and it's not trash. I mean, it's not bureaucratic paper keeping, it's all, you may not agree with it, but it's saying things. They had several times more agents armed than the ATF force that initially attacked the Mount Carmel Church outside Waco on February 28, 1993. They just didn't have people on the other side who were shooters, who would defend their church or whatever it was, who defends a warehouse. I mean, people weren't really there, but the potential was high. And I'd have to say, if I know law enforcement, we've got a crisis up in British Columbia now where the Royal Canadian Mounted Police are calling a bunch of Indians who are camped out near Lake Gustafson terrorists. They're in a cabin, they're surrounded by law enforcement, which is shooting at them, and they're the terrorists. They haven't done anything, except they won't leave the cabin because they claim it's holy land or spiritual land, and they don't want to leave. And they're being called thugs. That was the mindset on the day of there. I guess I'm really still caught with the idea, the old idea of the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States that is ingrained in a lot of Americans, and particularly young lawyers who are kind of idealistic and believe in the idea of freedom and the power of the word and the truth. I believe the truth can set us free. I think that's the struggle. The real struggle is whether we can see the truth in time. If we can see the truth that we have killed 500,000 Iraqis, the overwhelming majority, infants, children, elderly, chronically ill, and emergency medical cases, by the sanctions. We know it. We've been told time and time again. UNICEF says 500,000 under age 5. I just say 500,000 altogether. It's very hard to count. But there's bad water and there's no medication for rehydration. There's no medication for common childhood diseases. There's severe malnutrition. They'd never known marasmus and kwashiorkor. If we knew the truth, we have to hope and believe we wouldn't let it happen. It's a crime against humanity. I just wrote a letter to the United Nations about it yesterday because September 8th, on the eve of the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, we'll vote again as to whether to continue those sanctions, which are killing people. because we want to get rid of Saddam Hussein. So we're going to kill all these babies? You'll never justify to me the life of one child to get rid of a political leader. You don't do it that way because you corrupt yourself. You are worthless if you'll take the life of that child to change that political system. You are worthless. You are dangerous. This is a weapon of mass destruction, these sanctions, that impact against a whole society collectively. The rich, it doesn't hurt them very much. They can buy what they need, even with the sanctions. The poor haven't got a chance. The mothers don't have milk. There's no powdered milk. The infants are drinking water and sugar, and they're getting marasmus and kwashiorkor and other things and malnutrition. They're dying. The truth could set us free. In the LaRouche case, they're book people. I have to confess to the intellectual weakness. I find reading easier than thinking, so I read constantly, nearly blinded myself from too much reading. Got 15,000 books at home, read most of them, unfortunately. As you can tell, I haven't learned much, but I haven't stopped yet. These are book people. They had publishing houses going on. Important publications, non-profit stuff. The government comes in and these are just some of the peripheral things that Odin and others might not have explained to you. But these are what they were about: ideas, information, social change, meeting the needs of human people all over the world, humanity all over the world. We're going to have 1 billion more people before the end of this millennium, century, decade, and the vast majority, 80% or more, are going to have beautiful, darker skin, and they're going to live short lives of sickness, hunger, pain, ignorance, and violence unless we act radically. And these books have ideas. Some will work, some won't work, but they're ideas. They can be tested in the marketplace, as we used to say. And they come in with a bankruptcy claim, a false bankruptcy claim against nonprofit publishing houses and shut them down. What's the First Amendment worth, you know? We'll silence you. You'll have no books out there. And not only that, then they take people who were contributing and supposed to be paid back their loans to the publisher and try to prosecute falsely on it. They put on witnesses to give false testimony. From the tens and tens of thousands of contributors and the thousands of people who gave loans, they come up with a baker's dozen, roughly, 13, 14, 15 people who got their feelings hurt, perhaps, and some who were mean-spirited enough to lie about it, and who didn't get their money back, although they were being paid back, because anybody can have a financial crunch where you can't pay back. Imagine what would happen to political campaigns in this country if you enforced laws strictly against those who are raising money like this by inquiring about all the people who gave money, whether they got what they wanted, what they expected, and whether they were misled about it or anything else. Nobody could run for office. We know in this society that we are a plutocracy, that money dominates politics, absolutely dominates it. Read this new book, The Golden Rule, by Thomas Ferguson, University of Chicago Press, about the role of money in our democratic society, how it absolutely controls not just the elections and not just the politicians, but the whole shebang. The media, the military, the industry, everything. And you call it democracy. We need some ideas. We need the good words out there, and that's why it had to be stopped, and that's why they came after him. I read the record. In addition to reading books, I read lots of records from trials. Absolutely no evidence to support a conviction there. If you take it all. If you exclude the parts that were false or venomous, there's not even a shell. But they had to say that this noble enterprise, agree or not with it, was corrupt. Have nothing to do with it. It's corrupt. Nobody respects financial or other corruption. Destroy them that way. They were put to trial without any chance to prepare their case. And they made a valiant effort and got consecutive sentences. Unbelievable. When the government will use that much force, that much energy, that much of its resources to destroy an idea or a movement or people. Now let me go down to Waco for a few minutes. Those people that live there, it's gentle eastern plains between the woodlands of East Texas and the broken semi-desert and hill country of central and west Texas. Beautiful farmland. They've got them a site up on a hill. They built a church that preached and prayed and read the Bible together night and day, night and day, more than I ever have. I still pick up the good book and read it. They had a fire, burned the church down. Like any church, they had some problems. They had the son of one of the founders who has been in the state mental institution for many years now. He would threaten somebody, kill one person with an axe, threaten them to come back. They lived in Texas, and they're not immune to the cultural values of the whole society, so some of them liked guns, not so many. The fact is that the number of guns in the church per capita were less than the average Texas household. That's a statistical fact, and which is too many guns, but it's not as many as other folks have, just plain old folks all over the state. Most of their guns, in fact, 70%, were in two categories. Collector's guns, old Texas Ranger six-shooters, and crated M15s, M16s that were being sold at gun fairs. Gun fairs, it turns out, I hadn't known this, we're all ignorant just on different subjects, are big business, and they're going on all over the country. And people drive 250 miles in Texas for the next gun fair out there in San Angelo or over in Lufkin or wherever it may be. And 4 or 5 of the folks in the church, at least one of whom had a license, started going to those gun fairs, and they were making money for the church. I mean, those people all kind of contributed what they had and had vows of poverty and lived a pretty good life. They hadn't hurt anybody. The evidence of child abuse was non-existent. The demonization of them by this young woman on television, she had said on the Larry King show that nothing had been done to her except she'd been threatened. Her father, whose wife and the mother died in the fire, and who hated David Koresh, had filed an affidavit in a child custody case in Michigan when she was 13 years old, 2 years after this alleged incident, which didn't happen near the church. It happened in California anyway, and her mother was right there and other adult people. That he filed in the affidavit that he thought his daughter was in danger, that nothing had happened to her yet, but that if she was permitted to be in the presence of her mother and David Koresh, she was afraid something would happen to him because they have licentious ways or something like that. But here's 2 years after the alleged fight. Anyways, we all have seen demonization. We know how it can destroy people. We have to be extremely careful in scrutinizing it, or we'll be taken in time and time again. The ATF had no evidence. I've reviewed this case ad nauseum with all the evidence that we have. If you look at the affidavit for the search warrant, they had no evidence. They had no knowledge within 5 months of any illegal weapons in the place. To serve a search warrant or to arrest David Koresh Would have been the easiest thing in the world, any day of the week. I have a good friend from Waco, Bernie Rappaport, he's the president of a big insurance company down there. He called me when he heard I was in the case and said, you know, there's a good friend of mine who has a hardware store 2 blocks from where I'm sitting. And he said, David Koresh came in there on that Friday, and he's got the receipt. He'll give it to us. We've got it. $139 worth of hardware. There he is walking the streets of Waco buying hardware the Friday before the Sunday raid. Sunday because that's when everybody's in the church. This is a church. And these guys come in, they've got masks, they've got hoods, they've got firearms, and they get ambushed surrounding the church and on the roof of the church with helicopters. That's an ambush. There was one of the church members worked for the post office, and he had some special delivery things, and he was driving back to the church and was stopped and said, don't go in there because it's going to be raided by some media people who had been alerted. Said they're going to be helicopters and everything. So he didn't go back in, he phoned in. And then got a private car, he didn't, not the mail truck, and came in, got there in time to get killed when the front door was open. He was one of the ones that was shot and killed. But he told him that he heard it was about to be raided. ATF had an agent inside the church, so much for the sanctity of the church. If they had an agent inside, he couldn't find out. He'd been in there for months. Whether there were guns in there, they had nothing from him about being guns in there. He has said he didn't know of any guns in there that were illegal. And yet they come in with this huge force. We don't know exactly how many, but they have conceded at least 75 heavily armed agents. And what they conceded was a surprise attack. No knock. And then a 51-day siege in which their psychologists dreamed up everything they could to torment these people. They said, this is our purpose, to torment these people, to drive them out into submission. 150 decibel music in the middle of the night, sounds of rabbits screaming when they're being killed, Buddhist chants, bright lights that makes you board up the windows because you can't sleep in the night, turning the electricity off, cutting the water off, tormenting you about milk. You want a little milk? Maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day, we'll see. Calling the night before the big final day, saying, we're going to have some milk for you at 11 in the morning. That's to make them not be alerted. And then at 6, you come in with 11 armored vehicles, an Abrams tank, 9 Bradleys, and then there are one other tank and 3 CEVs, combat engineering vehicles. And you start gassing that entire church at 5:58 a.m. At 6:14 a.m., your logs show that you have gassed the entire church from the new tornado shelter. They have tornadoes down in that country. It's got a long, about 120-yard tunnel under there. Part of it goes through an old school bus they buried. I guess if you got tired, you could sit in the school bus seat and for a little while and then go on down to the shelter. And they gassed that. They gassed every room in the church. They gassed it 7 times. They started punching at the church with these vehicles, whamming it in. The whole back end had fallen in. The whole gym area had fallen in. Fires had started back there, as even the chief arson investigator for the Joint Task Force said, anytime you start running a 60-ton vehicle into a frame building, you got a risk of starting a fire. Makes sense, particularly when there's no electricity and you've been using kerosene for fires and all the rest. Determined to say they shot first, determined to say they killed themselves. Anybody thinks they killed themselves after enduring for 6 hours the battering and the gassing that they went through, and to say they killed themselves, they're all separated all over the place, makes no sense anyway. They couldn't have killed. I mean, somebody could have started the fire that killed them. 9 got out. of the 9 that got out, not a single one says there was any intention on our part or anybody's part in here that we ever heard of to start a fire. We thought we were going to get out. Clive Doyle talking about having a suitcase packed, ready to go. He thought it was going to be resolved. Anyway, that's on and on. Janet Reno, after it's all over, saying, I don't know what else I could have done, which means you have to do it again. It couldn't have come out worse. Of the 80 people that died on the 19th of April, 1993, 21 were men. 27 were children under 18, and the rest were women. And they were beautiful people. There were videotapes taken of each of them in March to send out to the families. And it breaks your heart. I sat by the mother of 2 little girls sitting on a bench, and they're talking to each other and saying, no, we don't want to know. It was pretty frightening when they were shooting, but we're happy and we want to stay here, and we hope we'll see you soon, Mom, and come visit us. And we know it won't be very long before we're out, and we've got everything we need, and don't worry about us. And they're incinerated by a government that didn't have to do anything. The right to be let alone, is still one of the most comprehensive and treasured rights of a civilized people, and we were going to destroy this church because we found it threatening. I've already mentioned that Tuesday, Monday's Labor Day, Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman's final arguments will begin. That case is absolutely unbelievable. Here's a man who's in his late 50s, been blind since he was 10 months old, done nothing his whole life but pursue his religion, graduated from El-Azhar University in Cairo, at least the Egyptians would say the most famous of all the Islamic universities of the world, older than any school in Europe, or naturally in the United States, with highest honors, an enormous following, a fundamentalist who believes in the Quran, as do in varying degrees 1.5 billion other people that call themselves Muslims on the planet, overwhelmingly living in the poorest parts of the world, from Mauritania and, well, even a huge country like Nigeria is close to 40% Muslim now, across North Africa and through the Middle East and Pakistan. India still got more Muslims than any country in the world except 3. Old Soviet Union got tens of millions of Muslims. Bangladesh, all through the Malaysian Peninsula and Indonesia, 150 million. Philippines with a huge population of Muslims, most living in poverty, many devout, by far the most rapidly growing religion in the world, in the United States, in the American prison. Nothing happening in the American prisons today, which are one of the worst places in the world, with a huge population growth, an absolutely staggering thing. I mean, our prison archipelago is it's quintupled since 1980. It's unbelievable. We've got 5 million people, including Lyndon LaRouche, in some form of custody right now because it includes parole supervision. We've got 1.5 million incarcerated. We have better than 27% of the African American male population between ages 16 and 25 in prison. In prison. I'm not talking about on parole. Can you believe it? More than 1 in 4. And at the rate we're going, by 2010, we'll have half. If that doesn't make you know we've got to do something, then God help us. What do we think we're doing? And executions constantly. A man last night, severely retarded, executed in Arkansas without a real hearing on whether he could possibly have understood what happened. Nobody cares. More than 3,000 on death row. We're the world's Lord High Executioner. And here we take this Muslim cleric and we charge him with the World Trade Center when the United States government knows as well as it knows anything in the world that he had nothing to do with it and knew nothing about it. And they're constantly getting new information that shows he was never involved in it in any way. They prosecuted people and he was never mentioned in the trial. He's charged with conspiring to murder Meir Kahane, a rabbi in Brooklyn. There were prosecutions for the murder of Meir Kahane. His name was never mentioned. They have absolutely no evidence that he had any knowledge that he'd even ever heard of Meir Kahane or even heard of the World Trade Center. They concede he never committed an act. It'd be almost impossible for him to commit a physical criminal act because he's blind, he's elderly, he's diabetic, he's not well. They claim he was the leader. And he didn't know most of the co-defendants. There were 16, it's now down to 10, 9 plus him. But what they want to say is that some of the most famous Islamic scholars in the world are nothing but common terrorists, even if they're blind. These Islamic people are dangerous. Even a blind scholar will be sent to the United States to blow up tunnels under the rivers in New York. Everybody in New York can just imagine being in that tunnel and the water coming in and cars in front and cars back and you're drowning. And there's not one scintilla of evidence that he'd ever heard of anything about blowing up tunnels, about blowing up bridges. When he was asked about blowing up the UN, he said it's not prohibited in Islam because jihad recognizes your right to attack a government. But you cannot attack the UN because it is seen as a center for peace, and it will be bad for Muslims. And we cannot establish the case that it's a government that's opposed to Islam. And he says, don't do it. And the government informant, this guy, Imad Salem, paid $1 million. $1 million. And $6,700 each month for spending money, you know? You have a few expenses along the way. That's free and clear of the million. So here they've got this guy coming in and trying to set up this blind cleric who has a religious duty to hear everyone who comes in. He sits there all night and hears everyone. Some of the tapes you hear that we had to get people's consent, and he's trying to, you've got a husband and wife who are fighting, and he's trying to work that out. It's really quite interesting to hear. And these people come in, and this guy's asking him, is it all right to attack, for Muslims to attack, is the UN the devil, he asks. This is the translation. Is it all right to attack the UN? And he concedes on cross-examination. He said, no, don't do it. And they're trying to engage also in protection of a client state, Egypt, to protect Mubarak. Because Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman has a huge following in Egypt. And if you get rid of him, you solved a lot of problems. But nothing like the problems of the people that Egypt have. If you haven't been to Cairo lately, you haven't seen trouble. I mean, you've got 15 million people living there. The housing there is unbelievable. There is no possibility of housing those people. There are over 800,000 people living in one cemetery and old mausoleums and things. And there's no running water. Every drop of water taken in there to drink and cook is carried by hand in buckets or whatever you carry your water in. And your sanitation, you go out. You take your trash out, you go to the toilet out. 800,000 people living like that. And on the dole. And I'll tell you something else about this. It's very important. You could walk through there at 11 o'clock at night, making a big noise, all by yourself, even if you were crippled. And you could have gold bracelets all up and down your arms, and you could have diamond necklaces all over you, and nobody'd lay a hand on you. They would not lay a hand on you. You wouldn't be mugged, you wouldn't be robbed, because they don't have that kind of violence in their character, in their society. If you're caught in adultery, they may stone you to death. I interceded in one of those problems over there one time by myself, and you got busted in the head with a big rock. I shouldn't have done it, perhaps, but I just couldn't stand it. But they're not violent. But what's going to happen to Egypt, if you don't have some opportunity for the people to participate? When they are living on foreign aid, there is no hope for those people. The overpopulation, the concentration. That's why we need ideas. That's why we need study. That's why we need analysis. That's why we need boldness and thinking and action. I've been through a lot of cases of persecution, more than I like to think about. And I've often said, when you win, you lose. I mean, the Kent State students who were indicted after the Kent State massacre, I mean, you shoot and kill 4 and then you indict the survivors. I represented the president of the student body. We struggled with that case for 4 or 5 years. It set the family back. It just knocked. They were civil service family from Columbus. They couldn't stand it. Their son, they were so proud of him. He's president of the student body. He's indicted for second-class rioting on the campus at Kent State, in which 4 students were killed. They've never gotten over it. They've never gotten back on their feet. Represented the Attica prison people. We got acquitted. The state police came in, shot and killed 39 people, including 9 hostages, because they couldn't wait. Everybody was in the prison yard, D yard. They couldn't get out. They weren't going anywhere. But the police couldn't wait. They were being embarrassed, so they came in, they shot up everybody, killed 9 hostages, and then they indict 70-odd inmates. And we win the cases. And we try to win a civil case, which we've never won. It's still pending, going to be retried this winter. And the inmates, you can imagine the misery of their lives. Half of them are back in, different things. Never gotten their lives together. Never really had a chance. Even in a case of religious commitment, like the Harrisburg 7 case involving, I represented Philip Berrigan and Elizabeth McAllister, and you had 7 people called Catholic radicals who were opposed to the war in Vietnam, and they'd take their blood and they'd go into draft boards, always poor people's draft boards, usually minority areas, because they didn't see why those young men would have to go and give their lives or kill a bunch of Vietnamese that they had no hatred against. And now they're under indictment and accused of trying to kidnap Henry Kissinger and blow up the computers in the Pentagon, stuff like that. And we win the case. But it takes 5 years. It takes all their energy and attention. It creates divisions. And the movement has never really reorganized. They've got the Plowshares movement now. So this is one reason to look at what's happening here. I don't know much about it. I just see it from afar. I'm just a lawyer. But talk about getting heavy body blows. This Lyndon LaRouche and his supporters and people that work with him. Heavy body blows. 5 mean years in prison. Constantly worried about health and all the rest. Continuing prosecutions with unbelievable sentences. 77 years, 44 years, whatever it is. Just, you can't say draconian. They're essentially psychological death sentences, if not physical death sentences. Constantly coming at you. And here they are. And here we are. And they're not only carrying on, they are prevailing. We have to examine that. We have to protect support that. I want to see the Mount Carmel Church rebuilt. I want it to be a memorial to faith and the indomitable spirit of humanity. I want to live with respect and love for the Muslim people. I want to help the Muslim people in their poverty and their misery as they are helping us in our prisons and elsewhere. And we have to find out how you overcome and how you prevail. And I think in hearings like this, if we can simply devise the means to insist upon integrity and honor and principle in government and in private life, and find the way to nourish ideas quickly that can save us from the misery that faces us unless we act with courage and compassion now. Thank you.
Gentlemen.
Mr. Clark, many Americans believe, as I do, that there is a concerted effort by the Justice Department and certain United States attorneys to target black officials. Among the people believing that are black mayors, black legislators, black officials, and even the Congressional Black Caucus, not one of the most aggressive and stand-up type groups. Evidence supporting this belief mounts almost by the hour. There's also developed what appears to be a pattern of U.S. attorneys picking high-profile black officials and using their prosecution as a stepping stone to Congress, to the governor's mansion, or wherever. I would be interested to hear what you have to say about that as a former Attorney General of the United States.
One of the, I started to say burdens, I don't know exactly what it is. One of the things that happens when you're around a long time and exposed to things like this is you realize the wisdom of Ecclesiastes, that there's no new thing under the sun. We lynched more than 3,000 blacks in the first 30 years of this century, and the murder rates in parts of the country were vastly underreported because assassinations, if you will, or summary executions of uppity young black males, basically what was happening, weren't counted. I saw a study recently, somebody went through parts of Louisiana looking for old graves, shallow, found unbelievable numbers. I watched Adam Clayton Powell. Lyndon Johnson was a funny man. He loved Adam Clayton Powell. And the real reason was he'd been a school teacher. And he once told me, he said, Ramsey, you won't understand this, but that man has done more for education in the United States than anybody in our history. I thought, Lyndon Johnson can sure exaggerate, What's this supposed to mean? What about Horace Mann and all those other people? Then I watched it, and I testified a few times up there before him. Now we're trying to privatize public education. It's unbelievable. Absolutely. We've let it degenerate in parts of the country Well, we watched what happened when we were trying to integrate the South and how school districts would simply close down the schools. I don't know how many times I had to go to Mississippi and elsewhere because they were simply closing down the public schools. Everybody's going to the private academy, the white folks going to the private academy, and just let the, bust the black kids out someplace else. We're not going to pay for their schooling, their public schooling. Adam Clayton Powell chaired the Education Committee, the House of Representatives. And I read everything comes out about him. Nobody has caught the dimension of his individual. Tell me an individual can't make a difference. His impact on public education in the United States, absolutely enormous, heroic. They tried to prosecute him when I was Attorney General. I looked at that stuff, and they'd come up with their files, and they'd point to all these things, and it was funny. One really funny thing happened. I've never been a big ABA, American Bar Association fan, but I had to go down and make a couple of speeches at the ABA in Miami. I was deputy at the time, actually. I think it was '66. All kinds of bad stuff was going on. I get back out to the airport to come back to Washington, rain, with 3 or 4 department people with me. And say, "Oh, sorry, there's no seats." And a car comes up, and a guy dashes up the steps with 2 women. It's Adam Clayton Powell, and he turns around, and he sees me. He said, "Ramsey, what are you doing out in the rain?" I said, "I'm trying to get on that plane. They don't have any seats." "Plenty of seats. Come on." Yeah, he's got about 6 seats up there for him and these 2 women. And I said, "Well, I got my buddies here." He said, "Well, I can't give you any more seats than I got, but I'll give you a seat for as many as we got." We put about 2 of them on. And they served the dinner, and he opens his briefcase, and there's a bottle of Tabasco sauce, biggest bottle of Tabasco. I thought they just made those little bottles. He's got one that big, and he's pouring it all over his food. And he's come back in from Bimini, where he's supposed to be doing all these corrupt things. What a bunch of garbage, The man loved life. He could probably outdance, what was the Robinson guy who was such a great dancer in those years? Yeah, fabulous, and unbelievable dancer. And he was a preacher, of course. He could out-preach practically any preacher you're going to find. And just an incredible man. He had style, he had class, he meant a lot to the people around him and to his whole constituency, because he said, you can be somebody, long before Jesse was born. Because look at Adam. That man can do it all. They had to put him down. Well, they never did convict him, of course, but it wasn't the Department of Justice, finally, it was the Congress. One of my old buddies had to go in there and represent Adam at the end, because he didn't have, he didn't care about money. He wasn't into that. He liked nice things, but he didn't ever save money or anything like that. We had to get some lawyers to represent him in the in the congressional hearings, and he finally got him out. Congressman Diggs from Detroit. And I started watching. And one day, the first assistant attorney general in the history of the United States, who was black, who's to this day one of the closest friends I'll ever have, came up and said, "They're coming after me, Ramsey." And he's always loved me, because I said, "Well, it'll have to come through me to get you." But IRS was giving him a hard time. At one time, back in the old days, when we only had a handful of blacks in the Congress, virtually every member, and this was before the caucus, was under investigation. They were picking off leadership. Fred Hampton was murdered because he was a brilliant young man. A brilliant young man. I don't know if you've ever seen any of those old videotapes, but you hear him speak and watch that guy. He can rouse people. People need to be roused, not to tear things down, but to build things up. We have to learn from the Stephen Biko lesson. What a tragedy. What an enormous human potential that young man had. He could have done anything. He could have been an Adam Clayton Powell or more. he had to be killed. He had to be taken care of. And that's what this is largely about. I read in the paper just the other day, Walter Fauntleroy. I couldn't believe it. I thought Walter would have called me. Most people do. I mean, there are very few of these cases I don't get called in, at least for consultation. But I don't know what it was really, but Walter pled to some darn thing. He just, Walter's he was of Dr. King's people. In many ways, he was the gentlest. I mean, they were a fabulous group, but he was the gentlest, and I worked for years with him, and a loving man. And what in the world is that supposed to mean, Of course it's going on. I mean, we would be absolutely blind to think it's not going on. And we really have to stand up to it. And it's not, I mean, just think of a double standard is to cheapen the idea. It's destroying leadership. It's destroying the ability to organize and be effective. It's to put a cap on things where you can control it, And I don't care if it's your worst political enemy. If they come after them on one of these bogus charges that we see constantly, stand up for them, stand up with them. I'll tell you this, I have seen unbelievable talent. I don't want to go through the roles because it's kind of demeaning. But when I think of the beautiful Congress people from Ohio and California and Texas, people that could do anything, neutralized, destroyed, harassed. We've at one time, and a long time ago, I'd say in the early 70s or late 60s perhaps even, I helped organize a group of black elected officials that had as its purpose at a public information level, not a legal defense level, addressing just what you're talking about. And I think that is probably more important today even than it was then. I don't say we haven't made progress. We have. I've said it earlier. Just seeing y'all here shows that we've made progress. I mean, I remember what it was like before the Voting Rights Act, and I spent the winter of '64, '65 in Selma and watched a priest, and I left just hours before a young woman who'd come down there just to help out and was driving people back and forth and was shot and killed. But all that struggle and those deaths, and we only increased voting registration in Dallas County, Alabama from 1% to 2%. All they wanted to do was vote here in the world's greatest democracy, I mean, those petitions that we carried in Montgomery were just for the right to vote. It seems unbelievable, doesn't it? That was all they were asking for. You'd think they were trying to rob the national treasury or something. All they wanted to do was vote. And they're getting shot, killed, beat. And fear. You know it, because you've been around a long time, but not as long as I have, but the fear throughout the community. In Mississippi in '64 in November in the presidential election, less than 7% of the voting age population of the state that was black was registered. It was dangerous. It was dangerous, or you had to, own the undertaker's place or the pharmacist's shop or something. And in '68, 4 years later, we had it up to 70%, but I've often observed that white registration went up to 107% at the same time.
Let me raise another matter with you. 30 years since we struggled in Selma and places like that. As I sit here speaking to you now, there is not a single entity, not a single institution in America that treats black folk with equal parity and equity. Not the church, not the government, not the university, not even the Red Cross. There was a time when we ran to the federal courts for justice. We now run from the federal courts. Do you really believe that a black person bringing a civil rights action in a federal court, staffed mainly by appointees of Reagan and Bush, sitting in Mississippi and Alabama, will do justice?
The probability is very low. I think a few observations need to be made. There's a really good book called Unlikely Heroes. Jack Nelson and LA Times reported, but it was about Skelly Wright and Frank Johnson, and it was mainly focused on the Fifth Circuit. There are heroes in life. I mean, what is there to believe if we don't believe in heroes? And there were people on the Fifth Circuit who saved the constitutional integrity of the United States by defending the 14th Amendment. If the Fifth Circuit had capsized, the Supreme Court couldn't possibly have handled the caseload, and the states wouldn't have accepted it. And we saw what happened. There was, I have to say this because I believe it and because it shows the possibility. There was a time when, within this limited vision, there were judicial officers and even a Supreme Court. Brown was 9-0. That believed that equality was desirable and possible and constitutionally mandated. And they wanted to do something about it. And we had impeach Earl Warren signs. We even persuaded President Eisenhower to say publicly that the worst mistake he ever made, when it was the best thing he ever did, as far as I know, was appointing Earl Warren. I don't believe in men on horseback, and I don't believe in salvation through individuals, but I knew Earl Warren well, and I do believe that his heart was pure, and that within the limit of his vision, he passionately desired to move our people on constitutional principles of equality. And I think the courts were working that way hard. And I think at the same time, you could go into a case before Judge Cox in Mississippi. He hauled our U.S. attorney in one time because I had ordered the U.S. attorney to not prosecute a young man, a young African-American who was heading up a poverty program and doing a good job, and they didn't like that. You do a good job, and that's dangerous, because it implies that black people have skills and talents and that poverty programs can work. So they wanted to say he was corrupt and indict him. I looked at the evidence and said, there's no evidence of corruption here. We're not going to indict that man. We're going to see if we can't get a little more funding for that program. And Judge Cox held our U.S. attorney in contempt, ordered an indictment, which he didn't have the power to do. Went to the Supreme Court of the United States and we won, but that was the kind of struggle we had. Racism is deeply ingrained in the character of the American people. You don't go through the tortured history that we've had of slavery and economic servitude, and suddenly you have a generation that just doesn't have any racism anymore. It doesn't work that way. I believe that it can be overcome. I will always believe that. I can't accept anything else. I may be irrational about it, but it doesn't. You don't eliminate it immediately. But I think if I know anything about what's happened in the last 30 years, there was a deliberate, carefully planned, highly financed effort to change all that, to turn it around, to roll it back, to eliminate from the court anybody who would stand for racial justice. I'll tell you, it was very hard. I took a lot of abuse in the government. That's why Nixon said the first thing he's going to do is get a new attorney general. But I took more abuse for resisting pressure on judicial appointments than probably anything else, including opposition to the death penalty and opposition to wiretapping and all the rest. And the reason was these senators would have their classmate or their brother-in-law or whoever it was, and they were determined to make him a judge. He's a terrible racist. And you put a racist on a federal court, and you have done a terrible thing to a whole population for half a generation or longer. A terrible thing. It is a criminal thing to do. And I fought and fought, and President Johnson would get very upset, said, you know, Senator so-and-so just demands we do that. We've got to do that. He's voted for us on this. He's holding this up. He won't do this. I said, I'm not going to do it. You have to get a new attorney general. I won't do that. I'm not going to send that name over here. I said, you don't have to. You can do it without me if you want to, because you're the president. I'm just the attorney general, but I'm not going to do it. And actually, I think he appreciated that. But there was you can talk about Roosevelt court packing. The court packing that's gone on since, I don't know how you feel about it, but the Clarence Thomas thing, I love Thurgood Marshall as I love my own father and mother and children and grandchildren. I've known him most of my adult life. He took my father's seat on the court. I remember the night of the riots in Washington, he came back over and sat in the chair in my office, and I said, Thurgood, what are you doing here? He said, he's on the court, and he said, I know I'm not supposed to be here, but it's the only place to be. He just came in and he said, I want to bear witness. He just came and sat there. But to replace him with Clarence Mitchell was a good man. Clarence Thomas is calculated. It's exactly what was being done when they tried to put that guy on from Florida, and Senator Ruska said a little mediocrity on the court would be a good thing, you remember? The guy's name began with the C. I can't think of what it was right now. He later got arrested for some dumb crime on the street or in a men's room or something. Whether it's a crime or not. There has been a deliberate nationwide effort to pack the courts with people who won't enforce the 14th Amendment or the statutes enacted under it that guarantee equality. But I think old Aristotle was right that the chief and universal cause of the revolutionary impulse is the desire for equality. Nothing hurts any human being worse than to be treated differently in a demeaning way compared to others. So we got work to do with the federal judiciary. I'll add this one thought, that over-reliance on the judiciary is a terrible weakness. The real power of the judiciary is extremely limited. The real power of the government's fairly limited, as tyrants have always found. We'll get the kind of courts we demand and deserve, perhaps. I dislike that concept because I hate to think, because so often the victim of the courts deserves better. But for the society as a whole, we'll get the kind of courts that we demand and deserve. And we've watched the glorification of appointing judges. I mean, I think it was the New York Times today, President Clinton is withdrawing a judicial nomination of a guy who fought for civil rights in the Department of Justice with us in the 60s because he can't get it past some of our southern senators in the Senate. It's extremely difficult today. It was never easy, even in the best of times. Although there was a time when we put some judges on there who were real heroes. I mean, real heroes. And they had crosses burned in their yards, and they were reviled, and they couldn't, if they belonged to a country club before, they couldn't go out there anymore because everybody walked out when they walked into the dining room or something, you know. sad to see. But that means at a grassroots level, we've got to work for a day in which we know the people who go on the courts of the federal government and the state governments and the local governments are personally committed to equal justice under law.
Representative Clark. As you mentioned it. Close.
Ms. Clark, you being a former general attorney, and you were saying that the problems that exist with investigation of African American elected officials, and that is almost commonplace in the Department of Justice and departments within the Department of Justice. How does an attorney general that knows what's going on and that these charges are somewhat vague continues to stand by and let the department falsely accuse and go after elected officials in the manner that they're going, and has been going on for decades?
Well, I don't think an attorney general can. I think where you may not have the power to correct it. I never claimed the power to fire J. Edgar Hoover. He was director of the FBI before I was born. And if the president had to choose between me and Hoover, and I don't care whether it's Kennedy or Johnson. And I was assistant to Robert Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy had as much use for Mr. Hoover as I did. I can't say that I really know what President Kennedy thought, but I can guess. But he wouldn't dare touch him. But you either enforce the law fairly as to important matters, or you resign. That's your choice. In the years that I was Attorney General, there was not a single prosecution by the Department of Justice, as far as I can recall, of a black elected official. No, I'm trying to show the problem.
Okay.
In those days, there weren't many at the federal level, and they were threatened. Diggs was prosecuted while I was in the Department of Justice 8 years. I was Attorney General 3, and he was appointed. He was chairman of the subcommittee on Africa, Foreign Affairs. What a beautiful appointment! What a very important appointment for a black elected official. It was a time we only had 3 or 4 members of the Congress from. People didn't like power, didn't like the image of that. You'd think they would, but the problem was he'd go around Africa and he'd try and do the right thing because it hurt. You see what's happening there, and you think, my God, I want to help these people. So they had to get rid of him. They prosecuted him. Powell, they tried to prosecute, and we stopped that. In a way, the Janet Reno issue today, and I've been very anxious for her. I really think she's got good qualities in her. But she knows that Waco was wrong. She has to know that Waco was wrong. There's no way you can have 80 people die like that. All you had to do was leave them alone, You didn't have to have those screaming rabbits blaring at them all night long. You didn't have to punch in their place with tanks. And to say she doesn't know what else she could have done with all those dead people and all those children, you have to have people that'll face up, and if they won't, you got to make them face up. The congressional hearings were a real instruction. We have to be very careful. What I saw in the congressional hearings on Waco was that there was not a member, and some of those members I really love. John Conyers, I remember when he first came to the Congress, he scared the establishment to death. I loved him for it because he was young and fiery in those days when he first came in. And they thought, wow, this is a wild man. What are we going to do? You know, this was when people were going around shouting, "Burn, baby, burn," stuff like that. And you had one of them in the Congress. They scared them to death, which I don't believe in scaring people to death, but a little soul stirring doesn't hurt. But none of them had the courage, not a single one, in the obvious face of misconduct by the FBI. They were willing to attack the ATF a little bit, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency, because, you know, it's not big, it's not powerful, it's endangered anyway for a variety of other reasons. And some of their best friends, like the NRA, are opposed to it. And so they'll attack the ATF a little bit, but you don't have probably in the Congress, but certainly not on those committees. There were two committees. A political figure with the will to stand up to law enforcement. And the reason is we've let the fear of crime so overwhelm us to think of the risk of being attacked by not just the FBI, but the law enforcement constituency as a whole. You know, you're soft on crime, you're weak on crime, you're trying to undermine crime, you've got criminal associations, you're going to be prosecuted yourself, all the rest. None of them had the will to do it. So they let those people get up there and say anything. They testified to things that were different than what they testified to in the San Antonio trial. We'll see how that comes out, because that's perjury. But we haven't, you know, we've waited a long time, I think, before we find any law actions filed. But they still won't tell us how many shots were fired from helicopters. Imagine flying over a church and shooting at the church from a helicopter. Unbelievable. Like Vietnam, you know.
Senator Fielding, did you have a question?
I wanted to address a question to Clark,
Get,
if I might.
get it on the microphone. Pick up the mic.
Oh. It won't come over, Mr. Clark.
Just go. I think it's safe. Yeah, that's as far as it comes. Have a seat here.
Excuse me. I was particularly interested, Mr. Clark, in some of the things that I had heard here, right here, in the last couple of days. And I don't know if you recall, I'm quite sure you don't recall, but I had the pleasure and the privilege of dealing with you on a social or political matter when you were Attorney General. And I've been impressed with your knowledge, and certainly impressed with your political outlook and your philosophical outlook and your compassion. But I've heard some things here in the past 2 days that really bother me tremendously about the United States Justice Department. We have heard tales of actually, I think, criminal and deliberate suppression of evidence by certain sections, what is that, OSI? Yes, in the Justice Department, and also what you call prosecutorial abuse by that particular section in the Justice Department and the Justice Department as a whole. And it really bothers me, and I'd like to know just what we can do specifically to ensure that this doesn't happen in the future.
Well, I think your interpretation of what you heard is right. Let me just talk about the Demjanjuk case for a moment, which I followed from its inception.
That's one of the
cases
that particularly bothers me.
Yeah, they got away with it all the way up to the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. And at the initial argument, they got away with it. But the chief judge is a fellow named Gil Merritt he'd been our U.S. attorney in Central District or Middle District of Tennessee. And he got to looking at it, and he got upset, and he persuaded his two colleagues to appoint federal district judge as a special examiner to consider the conduct of the Department of Justice, and they started rooting it out. And they found that here this man called, the whole world had been told, including his grandchildren, that he was Ivan the Terrible. And Ivan the Terrible, just about as beastly a human being as you can imagine. He'd been put on trial in a way that was an unbelievable show trial. I was in Israel during part of it. And they shut down the school so the school children could watch. And using him as an instrument of teaching the horror of the Holocaust, and it was all false, absolutely false, and they knew it was false. They knew he was not Ivan the Terrible, but he was big and burly, even at 70, and he was from the Ukraine, and he'd been, captured and turned in. He'd been in the Soviet army as a Ukrainian, and he'd been, as they did with thousands and thousands, he'd been turned into a prison guard. I think OSI is such a special office. It arose from hatred. It was, a generation after World War II, when you've got septuagenarians and octogenarians, and if there's ever any chance or hope in life for reconciliation, the moral of OSI is this: if you can find a Nazi who's 95 years old and on his deathbed and death rattling, you can get to him and strangle him before he dies, do it. It really is. I've watched them strike fear in whole communities in Toronto, Canada, and Southern California, of Lithuanians and people from all over East Europe, because the elders are about to be grabbed, to appease hatred. Statute of limitations are special things, but there comes a time when you ought to believe that reconciliation is possible. You don't have to, you never forget, because the long struggle for freedom is between memory and forgetting. You don't forget, but you do reconcile. You do recognize our common humanity, and you try to pull people back together. And so this office is special. And because it was born in hatred, it does the things that hatred does, which means I've got a case now of a poor old guy. It just breaks my heart to even think about it. He never hurt anybody in his life. He's a victim. He was in a prisoner of war camp as a Soviet prisoner. And 300,000 people died, and he survived, and he comes in, and he didn't hurt anybody, but it looks like he was at a place called Troniki, so it looks like he was involved somehow or other, but whether he was or not, it doesn't matter. If you can use him to show another generation how awful it was and punish elderly people. There's a young woman, not too young anymore, lives right out here, whose father went through that. It killed, when they came after the family, they were proud Estonian nationalists. They believed in their culture, so they would have their music and the folk music and all the rest. And the Soviet Union didn't like that because it generated strength to oppose their regime in Estonia. So they would start supplying information to the government, and others picked it up, and they picked him up. The mother died of heartbreak, I guess, and he finally died. They killed him, prosecuting him. He never hurt anybody in his life. In fact, I think he saved some Jewish prisoners one time. He told me he did, if I believe the story. But OSI ought to be abolished. It should never have been created. It's an instrument of hatred when there ought to be an end to it. It's not, however, the office that caused Waco or so many other things. We have a new and dangerous mentality. We have developed a police mentality that loves the SWAT team, the image of the SWAT team. They absolutely love it. They don't believe they're real policemen unless they can come in with a Rambo fire capacity and shoot up the place, we worked hard at the idea that a police officer is a public servant. He is a civil servant. She has an obligation to serve the community, to reconcile, to prevent violence, not to cause violence, to solve problems, not to create problems. I believe community service training for police is absolutely essential. But now we have a mentality of police at war with the public. The FBI and the ATF, the part they like are these hostage rescue teams and things like that. That's where you get in the movies, and there's glamour, and it's just an extension of Green Beret warfare to the domestic scene. We have to stop it. The prosecutors fall in with it. They identify people that they want to eliminate, and they go after them. And it's a pretty awful experience when they come. You need lots of friends and support if we hope to protect the country from it.
Senor El Saviv.
Sí. Mi nombre es Marino Elseviv, abogado de la República Dominicana. Perdóneme que no le hable en inglés para poder hacer la pregunta concreta.
My name is Marino Elseviv. I'm a lawyer from the Dominican Republic. I'm sorry I'm speaking to you in Spanish, but that's the way I can express myself clearly.
I love to hear your Spanish. I'm sorry I'm not speaking to you in Spanish.
Y lo siento que no pueda yo hablarle en español.
Muchas gracias.
I love the Dominican Republic, too, I
Y
have to
también
add.
me gusta la República Dominicana.
Muchas gracias. Thank you. El caso del señor LaRouche lo hemos conocido desde su principio, ya que estamos muy ligados al movimiento desde el año 1984.
Sí. The case of Mr. LaRouche, we have been aware of it from the beginning. We have been close to his movement since 1974.
Estamos convencidos de que hay una persecución, de su persecución.
And I believe that the hegemonic powers, centers of powers in the United States are the one who have pressure for his persecution.
Llámese también los centros económicos como el Fondo Monetario Internacional y los grupos que dirigen la política económica de los Estados Unidos.
As well, the economic power centers such as the IMF and other groups that run the economic policy of the United States.
En esta etapa del proceso, ¿usted contempla la posibilidad de pedir a los representantes del pueblo americano una audiencia, como dicen, a 20 minutos de acá, para dar a conocer esta persecución política en contra de LaRouche?
In this stage of the game, how do you see the possibility of asking these representatives of the American people for a hearing? Someone said here yesterday, 20 minutes away from here in Washington, to make known the LaRouche case.
We've been trying in every way we can, others much more than I, to make the LaRouche case known. I personally have appeared at meetings in Europe and North America. There have been books and pamphlets, and there's a constant flow of literature and verbal communication. We've tried for, I can't tell you how many years right now, but several years, maybe 4 even, to explore the possibility of fair hearings in the Congress. Hearings are risky in a highly political environment like that. We saw how the Waco hearings went, and without any opposition, the world was told by law enforcement that the church people shot first and started the fire and killed themselves. And beside that, they were child molesters, deserved to die. So there's a continuing effort. I think it will bear fruit. We've asked the Department of Justice for a comprehensive review. Lyndon LaRouche always asks for a review not only of his case, but of all cases where there are allegations of serious misconduct, and usually names a bunch of them. And so we've always done that. That's his vision. It happens to be my vision, too, of how you correct things. But the capacity of the Department of Justice for self-criticism is of a very low order. It has two offices that are charged with the responsibility. One's called the Office of Professional Responsibility, and one's called the Office of the Inspector General, and neither have ever done anything very serious I'm aware of. Maybe someone was caught stealing pencils or something, taking them home for the kids. That's about the dimension of their address. So our efforts to secure review of injustice, we've tried in the courts. I mean, we've sought habeas corpus, which is the grand English, it's the writ of amparo in the Dominican Republic. It's the grand old way of reviewing injustice and wrongful conviction, and we got short shrift. We had to go back to the same judge who gave us the fast shrift the first time, the depleted uranium rocket docket. So we have to find solid means. The media is a great problem. The media is controlled by wealth and power that prefers the status quo, and it's very sophisticated in how it manages these matters. I can take a cause that they're interested in that's virtually meaningless and be on primetime evening news. And I can take on a cause of what I consider to be international importance of the highest magnitude that they oppose and shout from the rooftops, and you'd never know I existed. That's the way it works. So we've got to, that's one reason that that the publications, the books and magazines and newspapers that spread the word, are, even though they're minor compared with the huge international media conglomerates that we're confronted with, but they reach thinking people, and they spread the word. I think we'll get our hearing in time, and I think it'll be a reasonably short time, but I think it's going to be meaningful. It's going to take a regeneration of moral force in the American people. I'm both an optimist and an idealist, so you have to take what I say with a grain of salt. But I believe that the civil rights movement was the noblest quest of the American people in my time. I think it was real and vital and passionate, and I think it consumed the energies and faith of some few millions of people. I mean, we really believed in it. We were marching and singing and doing. And then it kind of dribbled out. So that now we have these vicious fights that divide us. When I think of the Dominican Republic, first I have to think of Haiti and what's happening there now and the horror of that. And then I think of a young Dominican who I represented on death row in Texas. And I'll have to say, even your president and your ambassador from Washington came to Austin. The president didn't come. He sent a letter, but the ambassador from Washington came with me to Austin to seek. But they executed 3 aliens in Texas that week. 2 Mexicans and a Dominican. And at least as the Dominican, they had him strapped on this gurney with 5 belts across him. And there were 4 of us who loved him and knew him. I'd worked with him for 5 years on death row. He'd been on death row 5 years before I met him. He looked up before they injected him with, they already had the needle in both arms. He looked up and looked at us, looked at each of us in the eye, and he said, "Love is the answer, not violence." Those are the words of a 28-year-old man born in the Dominican Republic in poverty and executed in Texas in 1993. We have to have a moral regeneration and energy and commitment and faith and belief that we can overcome, that equality is desirable, that justice is essential, that a life of principle is the only life worth living. And then we'll get our hearings. Then we won't need our hearings, but we'll have to keep on.
We'll terminate in a very few minutes. In the meantime, Dr. McCloskey of Yugoslavia would like to ask a question.
Slovakia and Yugoslavia. State Department publish every year such a report about human rights violation all over the world. I'm vice chairman of Helsinki Committee in Slovakia, Bratislava, and some clerks visited me a week ago. And I should give them information about human rights problem in Slovakia. Then I asked them also about, on the end of our discussion, about human rights violation in United States, and we arranged some meeting in the end of September. After this hearing, I have many arguments, interesting arguments for them. My question is, they underlined that such a report is very important for the attitude of United States to Slovakia, as long as trade, as long as loan, help, and so on through Congress. And my question is, by what philosophy or motivation America made such a report every year and absolutely ignore your own situation at home? And who should write such a report which will speak about human rights violation in America, because they are too much?
Yeah. Well, this is a very important observation for particularly the Americans here. I worked for years to get those so-called state reports authorized. The Congressional Black Caucus worked hard for it. They're highly political. We've used human rights. I think of myself as growing to maturity in the civil rights movement, and when I got out of the government, I wanted to move into the human rights movement, which is simply civil rights internationally as far as I'm concerned. And almost immediately, for instance, I went in and became a board member of Amnesty International. There weren't 40 members in the United States. And I went to London and examined their roles. 70% of their cases were in 2 countries, Argentina and the Soviet Union, which is just it's political selectivity. The State Department criticizes our political enemies and ignores our political friends. As President Roosevelt said of Somoza, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch, so we don't criticize him. And criticizing ourselves, we have this myth. There are no political prisoners in the United States. There's no injustice in the United States. There may be mistakes from time to time. We're the world's greatest democracy. Once in a while, as we did last week, we read in the newspapers about corruption, and we see that an international organization has evaluated us, I think it was 9th in corruption among that is, there are 8 nations less corrupt in their political process than we are. We're not even a democracy. Money dominates our political process. That has to be understood to realize where we are. It absolutely dominates the political process, the political figures, and the acts of the government. So we need introspection. We need to know ourselves. But we desperately need the help of our friends around the world. When I've always opposed the death penalty, and in 1965 I brought the Department of Justice out against the death penalty for the first and only time in our history, and we haven't had a federal execution since. And we didn't have a state execution until 1977, when Gary Gilmore was executed. The first year in our history without an execution was 1968, which was the year of our greatest race riots, the year of the assassination of our prophet of nonviolent social change, Martin Luther King, the year of the assassination of a political leader with the greatest moral fervor among our conventional politicians that I've seen, Robert F. Kennedy, something that came on late in his life after his brother's assassination. But we stopped it. Now, when Gary Gilmore was about to be executed, we went to the international community, and letters poured in on the governor of Utah. And he was amazed that others cared, and he was embarrassed by it. He said he didn't mind what the Americans said, but the letters from abroad criticizing us, because nobody criticizes us. We were criticizing. It's amazing. On abolition of the death penalty, I always use South Africa as the illustration. South Africa was the Lord High Executioner. They were executing several hundred, admittedly, a year. And most years they were all black. Once in a while there would be a white person, but he was always accused of conspiring with the ANC or something. And we weren't executing anybody after 67. Today, the Supreme Court of South Africa has abolished the death penalty. South Africa does not have a death penalty. They are not executing. There is moral leadership that says we don't do that because we know who gets executed. It's the poor and those who can make a difference, like Stephen Biko. We don't do it. And we've got 3,000. If you examine our criminal justice system, now, I know this sounds awful, and I don't mean to detract from the horror of the political prosecutions like Lyndon LaRouche, but if you examine our criminal justice system, or non-system, which is what it really is, you'll see that it is little more than a means of controlling young male minority members who are given very little chance in this society to do anything. Because we're rounding them up and we're sending them to prison. That's what we're doing. We're not sending them to college. We're not supporting their families so they can have a chance. We're not doing the things you have to do if we want all that talent to be liberated for everybody's joy and good. And if that's not a political crime, I don't know what is. I mean, you can talk about apartheid till you're blue in the face. That is a form of using, and that doesn't mean that they didn't mug somebody. It simply means that we won't pay attention to what causes it. We want to crush them. And we're going to go on like that till we tear this country apart. We can't permit that. So we desperately need to be indicted for our prison system. We have built more prison housing in the last 10 years than public housing. Can you believe it? For the whole population. And there's not a city in the United States that doesn't have thousands and thousands of homeless people and tens of thousands of families struggling to survive as a family in inadequate housing, dangerous housing, unhealthy housing. And we're spending more on prisons than public housing? Madness.
You've been very patient. This may be the final question, although I may have trouble. Representative Watson from Mississippi.
General Clark, would you share with us some of your experiences and ideas about the Internal Revenue Service involvement in some of the oppressive actions that we have been talking about here today?
It's serious and it's major. Historically, it arose from the fact that a large segment of the African American population historically didn't file income tax returns, you know? And the reason is they didn't have income, or finally they were making a little income and nobody told them, you know, or it just didn't seem to be a part of their lives. I mean, it's not a part of my life. They exclude me from everything else, you know. I'm not a part of any other segment of the society. What's the IRS to me? I don't know anything about it, you know. So the fact is, in the early years, that IRS was the most convenient, the easiest enforcement agency for addressing black leadership, black elected officials, including preachers and all the rest, because there was a common high frequency of non-filing. And you had the goods. I mean, it's true you don't usually prosecute for that, but and then you got this problem. You know, you started out, you didn't have any money, you finally got a job, and finally, but you probably weren't on a payroll, so there was no withholding, so you never, a lot of major early black elected officials had never filed a return. So then you got the question, what the hell do I do now? You know, I've never filed a return, and if I file a return, I expose myself. And procrastination and other things cause them. I say this because I've been down to IRS with a lot of them to explain and try and work it through, and we've worked a lot through. But it's been a major instrumentality for what I call discriminatory prosecution. Not the most dangerous, but impermissibly it's permitted itself to be used, and still does. So it requires, and you know, getting into the IRS is a monster. It's huge, and we've got to be careful that we don't. I mean, we're trying to privatize everything, which means the poor have nothing, absolutely nothing. We've got to resist that. There are essential services that the government has to provide for the poor of this society to help uplift them, and it includes health and education and welfare and housing and all the rest. And you can't just abolish, like these new economists want to do, IRS and progressive income tax and all the rest. But it has to be, you know, there have been times and places where IRS couldn't get a conviction. That's good citizenship. It may sound strange to hear me say that, but there were 7 federal judicial districts in the United States when I was Attorney General in which there had never been a conviction for an IRS violation. And the reason is those good citizens just say, to hell with you, you know. You tell me that, and I say, you take care of your business, and we'll take care of ours. Not guilty. Anyway, we have to watch IRS, and we have to stop it. I think it is a priority, but it's a lower priority than some of the other prosecutorial abuses right now. Thanks very much for your patience. I know I answered long, but I'm from Texas. What else can I say? Good to be with you.
Well, You've been on the stand for 2 hours, and we appreciate it very much. Oh. That's the thing. That was the purpose of my ignoring you. I knew you could do that.